Good afternoon, everybody. We'll get started so we can keep timely. My name is Becklin. I teach in History and Asian Studies here at the college. I'll also be presenting on Saturday. But it's nice to see you all today, and I'm very excited to introduce this talk for you. Dr. Ralph Meier is an associate professor of religious studies at Volda University College in Volda, Norway. He's been at the university since 2000, correct? And before living in Norway, he was pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Schaumburg-Lippe in Germany. His main field is one of systematic theology, but for years, Dr. Meier has also been busy researching the Norwegian Lutheran Churches in America, especially their connections between the Norwegian Synod and the Missouri Synod, which is very interesting. That happened in the second half of the 19th century. He's spoken and published on this topic in English, German, and Norwegian, and today he will bring us a discussion of the diversity of Norwegian-American Lutheran synods from the early days of 1846 to the formation of the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America in 1917. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Meier today.
Yes. First and foremost, I want to express my gratitude for the opportunity to be here at St. Olaf in Northfield. It's truly an honor and a privilege. First, I have to make a confession that you already understood. I'm neither American nor Norwegian. I'm a German living in Norway. But may I say it with words of Roger Hodgson from the band Supertramp? Don't leave me now. And if we were in Norway today, in Volda, where I live and teach, I could quote Roger Hodgson too with the words, "It's raining again." Okay. Well, for over 10 years, I've been studying the Norwegian Lutheran Church in the United States, with a particular focus on the Norwegian Synod and its connection to the German Missouri Synod. As a German living in Norway, I have had the opportunity to read numerous letters, articles and books, both in English, Norwegian and German. But today I will be discussing the history of Norwegian Lutheran churches in America from the broader perspective. All these Lutherans. This title of a book from Todd Nickel, Professor Emeritus from St. Olaf, could also be the headline of my presentation. And this does not just mean that there are so many members of the Lutheran Church in America, but that there were so many different Lutheran churches or synods only from the Norwegians. Norwegians were involved in establishing more than 10 different Lutheran synods between 1846 and 1900, although some of them were a merger of former synods or simply changed their name, and they did not exist all at the same time. But nevertheless, what a number, compared to the one evangelical Lutheran state church in Norway in the midst of the 19th century, or the Roman Catholic Church as one church body. In 2018, I visited some of the early Norwegian church foundings and came to Koshkolong Prairie with churches in Stoughton, Wisconsin. Let's see what I found. First, on the western side of Koshkolong Prairie, I found the West Koshkolong Lutheran Church and the Western Koshkolong Lutheran Church. And you see them in the background and in the foreground. Two Norwegian-American Lutheran churches side by side. I drove on to East Koshkolong, and there I saw first East Koshkolong Lutheran Church and East Koshkolong Lutheran Church. So in the 1890s, there were 4 Norwegian-American Lutheran congregations Okay, I must say belonging only to two different Norwegian Lutheran Churches or synods. But you understand the picture. But when we look at the history, after many different Norwegian Lutheran synods, in 1917, the new Norwegian Lutheran Church of America was formed, representing over 90% of all Norwegian-American Lutherans. This process from a situation with several synods to a union can be seen as a search for a common Norwegian-American Lutheran identity. And in my talk I will present the history of the Norwegian Lutheran Churches in America from diversity to unity. And also try to answer the questions, why were there so many different synods and what were the reasons that nearly all of them finally united. Okay, let's first have a glimpse to the first major group of immigrants to America, which left Norway in 1825, as we all know, the event we are celebrating now. The religious motive was, besides the material and economical one, an important one for many of those travelers who made that journey. The immigration from Stavanger in 1825, with 52 persons on board the Restoration, was organized and led by a Quaker, and he was also the captain of the boat. Those of the immigrants who either were Quakers or sympathized with them were in opposition to and in conflict with the Norwegian authorities, because they were not allowed to practice their religion in Norway as they wanted. And this group emigrated not only from Norway, but also from the boundaries of the Norwegian state church. This was not the case for the vast majority of those who later left Norway when the regular immigration started in 1836. Initially with a few hundred immigrants each year, but later up to 20,000 each year who emigrated. Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North and South Dakota, and Iowa were the main states in the first centuries when the Norwegians arrived. Later, several states in the west and northwest too, as you may know. Until 1915, about 850,000 Norwegians had emigrated to America. That were a lot of people compared with the population in Norway, which was about 2.5 million in 1915. And as I said, most people left Norway, especially then of economic and social reasons, but let's not forget, and I will explain it later, they took their religion with them. Just some photos that will illustrate some of this process. Here a photo leaving Hardanger from 1897. We see the children of a family leaving Hardanger with a one-way ticket to America, usually. Another picture from America, Wisconsin, a farm scenery that shows plenty of land for this farmer in Wisconsin compared with Norway, and these pictures, of course, were also sent to Norway to show what they could get. Or let's have a look at different houses on the prairie, quite different houses. And they could be all of several kinds. Here we see on the left side Pastor Ottersen in Korskonong, Wisconsin. You heard the name before. He was one of the founders of the Norwegian Synod and a very popular, prominent person. And see the man with the Norwegian flag on the roof. And on the right side, we see also Norwegians, a farmer's home in North Dakota. And they show also their best things they have. Look at if you can, look the table with the porcelain and also the two horses in the background. That's not that is a choice they made to have it on the picture, of course, to show that is our wealth, including this house. Well, how was it to be Norwegians in America in the 19th century? When we look at the Norwegian identity, we have, among other factors, last but not least, Lutheran faith as an important factor, because in the Lutheran state church, nearly all Norwegians were members of this church. Since 1537, the Lutheran Church had been a state church and as such an essential part of Norwegian culture and history until 2012, actually. It was state church in Norway. And it was a natural part of the people's life in Norway, given by birth. In Norway, people were under the umbrella of the state church, and under this umbrella there existed different groups, not maybe orthodox or more rationalistic and liberal and pietistic groups from the awakening movement under the leadership of Hans Nielsen Hauge, the Haugeans, who focused on lay preaching. They all were served by the pastors of the Lutheran Church with the sacraments and with confirmations, weddings, and funerals. So Lutheran churches were also, in America later, the most important institution for the Norwegian immigrants, and the church was the religious and cultural center of organized social life. That's important to realize. It often has been formulated that after the immigrants had arrived in America, they first built log cabins and then a church. And when they settled in America, they often traveled in groups from the same region in Norway or families, and so they had also their sub-communities in America based on the region and origin in Norway, which also could be important when we think of different synods. Before I present the different synods, I want to give a short view of three church pioneers, which also represent the different categories or groups in Norwegian church life. Yes, those were Erling Eielsen, Klaus Clausen, and Johannes Dietrichson. They all came to America between 1839 and 1844, and they are characteristic, as they said, for these three main factions in Norwegian Lutheranism in America. Although most emigrants from Norway did not leave for religious reasons, belonging to the evangelical Lutheran Church was given for them, and many missed the church when they arrived in the United States. From 1825 to 1844, no ordained pastor from the Church of Norway traveled with the emigrants to the US. And so in the early years, Norwegian Americans were served by lay preachers who traveled around. Erling Eielsen went to America in 1839, and he arrived in New York. His background was that he was raised in a Haugean pietistic home. His parents were farmers, and his home was actually frequently visited by Hans Nielsen Hauge himself. Before Eielsen came to America, he traveled already as a lay preacher in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. He was strictly anti-clerical against the clergymen in their long black vestments. And after arriving in the US, he headed first to Fox River, where 500 to 600 Norwegians already were living. There he observed many different religious groups as Quakers, Baptists, Methodists, Mormons, and others, as well as Lutherans, but not organized in a congregation. Erling Eielsen began working as an evangelist among the Norwegians and built a log meeting house for worship and gatherings. He traveled extensively, visiting Norwegians in Illinois and Wisconsin, and he also walked twice from Fox River to New York, first in 1841 to obtain English translations of Luther's Small Catechism, and again in 1842 to get Danish prints in Gothic letters of Pontoppidans' explanation of Luther's Catechism and also a Norwegian version of the Augsburg Confession. Maybe sounds interesting for a Haugean lay preacher, but that wasn't, as I may explain later. But then, surprise, Elling Eielsen, the anti-clerical lay preacher, was ordained by a German pastor in October 1843. How could this person that despised pastors and their rituals become an ordained minister himself? He explained it by saying that the people were like sheep without a shepherd, and that Haugeans in America had asked him to become a pastor. This is plausible because the Haugeans, as I mentioned, were used to pastors in Norway who conducted services with baptism, confirmation, communion, and the sacraments, as you can imagine. And that they were missing. It was not the same with the lay preacher. But another reason of this sudden ordination may have been, this is discussed and it's quite probable, that he heard about Klaus Clausen's, you see this person now, intention to be ordained, and he had arrived in America in July 1843. Clausen had been ordained. If Clausen had been ordained before Eielsen, Clausen might have become the pastor for the Haugeans instead of Eielsen. And so Eielsen came in contact with a Lutheran German pastor who ordained him in October 1843, as I said, about 2 weeks before Clausen. Yeah. Eielsen so became the first ordained pastor in America for a Norwegian congregation, this anti-clerical lay preacher. And due to the lack of an official call from a congregation and a proper examination, other Norwegian Lutherans did not accept this ordination. But this is another story that we do not have time to explain more. Let's go to the next person, Klaus Clausen. He was a teacher from Denmark who came to America after a call from Muskego in Wisconsin to serve them as a religious teacher. When Clausen arrived at Muskego, it soon became clear that both to him and to the community that he should not only be a teacher, but a pastor for the congregation. Eielsen had been there before, but they disliked him with his anti-clerical view and his focus on lay preaching, and they wanted a proper pastor who could baptize, confirm, and give the Holy Communion, marry and bury people. Clausen seemed to be the right man. So in September 1843, the Muskego congregation sent a formal letter with a call of Clausen, and I think it was Clausen himself who wrote this letter, but they signed it, with a desire to have Clausen ordained. And this is interesting because this official letter was the birth date of the first Norwegian Lutheran congregation or local church in America. I just gave the date 1846 because this was the beginning of the synods, the bigger church groups in America. So Clausen also made contact to a German Lutheran pastor, and he examined and ordained him 2 weeks after Eielsen, and Clausen was positive to both the Haugeans and the Church of Norway, which we will look at now. So he has sort of middle position between Eielsen on the lay preacher Haugean side and the third person I will introduce now. Many of you know him already, I suppose, from the literature, of course. This is Johannes Dietrichson, and he was the first pastor ordained in Norway before he left Norway to come to America, and he arrived in 1844. While Eielsen represented the Haugean revival movement, Dietrichson was an aristocratic high church pastor who represented the state church of Norway. And Dietrichson traveled to the US, as he writes, by himself to investigate the spiritual situation among the Norwegians,
to establish congregations and thus to lay the groundwork for a permanent church order among them. And this he did. He was in the US from 1844 to 1845 and again from 1846 to 1850 after a year's stay in Norway. And the last time he came due to a call from the Kashkonong congregation in Wisconsin. While in the US, Didrikson worked with Clausen together to establish several congregations in Wisconsin, and he wrote church constitutions and also a draft for a synodical constitution. And when Didrikson met Eielsen, yes, they did, they disputed about the legitimacy of Eielsen's ordination, and Didrikson was strong against it. And Eielsen finally shouted to Didrikson, "Listen to me, you Pope. I intend to plague you as long as I live." Yes, that was the Christian way of living at that time. And maybe today also, I don't know. Yes, Eielsen and Didrikson, they represented, as you can imagine, two extremes in their background and in their view of church. Eielsen was extremely low churchly, against the clergy, coming from the lower class in Norway, while Didrikson was high churchly, near episcopalism with bishops and the hierarchy, and an aristocrat representing the upper class. Clausen was the man between these extremes. He had sympathy for the Haugeans, but stood much nearer Didrikson than Eielsen in his view of the church government, and that was also the reason that they worked together when Didrikson was in the US. So these three men were not only church pioneers for the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America, they represented also the three groups of the Norwegian Lutherans in the years to come. Therefore, the presentation of these three men helps us to understand the different synods that were established. Now something general about Norwegian church foundings. So this is what we have to look at. Important, there was separation between church and state in America, the opposite from state church in Norway, to free churches in America. We have foundings of several Norwegian Lutheran synods. As I said, we count more than 10 different synods, including all divisions in the synods, and later I will also try to answer the questions around this. Also, there was freedom and democracy also in the church, and the lay people were aware of that. That had consequences for the people in relation to the pastors. The farmers and craftsmen had the same status as the pastors. I think the pastors not always agreed on it, but the lay people were very clear in it. In 1881, a Norwegian, Lars Urheim, living in Minnesota, writes in a letter to Norway about a pastor from the Norwegian Synod. "A pastor here is like a farmer at home in Norway. He goes to the barn himself and he takes care of his horses himself. Here is no distinction made between a pastor and a worker. It is not like in Norway where everyone has to take off his hat for the pastor. No, here everyone is quite farmer-like." And this was a quite typical expression. Then we have the change from passive to active membership in the church, which was very new for the Norwegian people. They had get used to it. That included that they had to organize the congregations with different tasks and responsibilities, as school buildings also, and teaching, financial affairs, help for the needed, and so on. Also, the congregation called and paid their pastors, each congregation separately. That does not mean that every congregation had their own pastor. That was not possible. There were too many congregations. There was one pastor served several congregations, but he got a call. That meant also, and he was paid by them, that the congregation with the lay people had power over their pastors. This is positive and negative, we may say. They called and, when it felt necessary, dismissed the pastor. We have several examples I will show later. We have time enough, I hope. Yeah. Local congregations joined the synod, which means that the local congregations could choose which synod they wanted to join. If they wanted to join a synod at all, that was not necessary, but it made sense. They were independent, and each congregation was regarded as a church. That was also a new thought. That was an important difference to the situation in the Norwegian state church, of course. About 25 to 30%, it's discussed, of Norwegians joined the Norwegian Lutheran Churches. That does not sound much, but thinking of, especially when we think of the strong religious connection to the church in Norway. But in Norway, we must remember, they were members by birth. Without voluntary membership, they didn't have to think about it. And it's very likely that many of those who never became members of a congregation took part in the worships. We have the situation today also. One is a member, another follows, maybe. We also know that the membership numbers of Norwegian in other churches or Christian groups were very low. That means they did not go to other groups so much as Baptists or Mennonites or Methodists and so on. Only about 3%. And this is quite few when we compare it to other Scandinavian groups. When we look to the Swedish, only about 20% of the Swedes joined the Swedish Lutheran Synod, the NORTANA Synod, which was the only Swedish Lutheran Synod in the US. And much more Swedes than Norwegians became members of non-Lutheran denominations, up to 30%, against the Norwegians with 3%. So the positive side of the many Norwegian Lutheran synods was that many Norwegians could find their spiritual home in the different synods when they could choose. Often they could not choose because they lived in one place and there was one church in one synod, right? So it was normal for them. But they could choose in many cases. So now let's have a look at the different foundings of Norwegian-American Lutheran synods in the US. Well, that's a complicated thing. Okay, we begin, as we have heard, with the Eielsen Synod. We heard about the ordination of Eiling Eielsen in 1843 as the first ordained Norwegian Lutheran pastor in America. And Eielsen, as we know, Eielsen and the Haugeans were focusing on lay preachment and informal meetings and services. But in America, they had this problem, as I mentioned before. They were no longer under the umbrella of the state church, where they were served by the pastors with the sacraments, confirmation, and so on. And in Norway, they had, in addition, their own meetings as lay groups when they could. But now in America, they were on their own, no longer connected to a larger church body. Therefore, Eielsen was ordained, but that was only the first step in organizing a church. The following years, some associates of Eielsen's pressed upon him the need of some form of organization. So in April 1846, in a church meeting, Eielsen dictated a text that became the constitution of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the so-called Eielsen Synod. So the Haugeans with Eielsen had the first ordained pastor in America in 1843, and they became the first constituted church body or synod also in 1846. And we can imagine what you remember what Eielsen did when he traveled. So the Constitution says that the synod is built on God's word and the Lutheran doctrines from the Church of Norway, and that the altar book of the Church of Norway is used. That sounds quite high churchly, but it's not really the case. This is typical Norwegian Lutheran. And we can find this in all Norwegian Lutheran synods, no matter. And that is, of course, very interesting for this lay people church, but it says also in this constitution, no one ought to be accepted as a member of our body except he has passed through a genuine conversion or is on the way to conversion. Important point for the pietistic groups. And also it says, it's important again, popish authority and ministerial garb is rejected. We have absolutely nothing to do with them, it says. What we do not find are regulations for the governing of the synod and the relation of a congregation to the synod. This may be seen as weak points. So it was quite normal for them to have these Lutheran confessions in use, also the altar book, but not with all the clergy things, vestments and so on. They did not look like pastors, maybe, but they did the work as pastors, and with these books. And we can imagine, and we already have seen, Eielsen was a very strong person and leader, and though it was not so, it was no surprise that there came tensions in the synod, and this was also typical for every Norwegian Lutheran synod, division and separation. From when they started, at one time they had divisions. And the majority established in 1876, the Haugeans Synod, which was really the Eielsen Synod with a new constitution, a revised constitution, but a minority, together with Eielsen, continued as Eielsen Synod. So we have this first division here, but only in the 1870s. Okay, this was the Haugean group. Now we come to the opposite, if we will call it. This is the Norwegian Synod, with the full name, Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, or Norwegian Synod, or only Synod, as they were called, was founded in 1853. The constitution was a revised version of the draft from the already mentioned Didrikson from 1849. Didrikson went back to Norway, and but between 1848 and 1853, 7 well-educated ordained pastors from the Church of Norway, ordained in Norway, came to the Norwegian settlements in America, and 6 of them, including Clausen, were present at a meeting in eastern Korskonong in 1853, together with representatives from 28 congregations. And there, the constitution was presented and discussed, and later accepted, because first the congregations had to accept this constitution, and then they could say it is okay. From these well-educated, high church-orientated pastors from Norway, one could accept something like a copy of the church constitution in Norway, only, of course, without a king as the head of the church. But actually, this constitution shows both continuity and change, old and new elements compared with the mother church in Norway. This I will show closer after presenting the last group. I just want to mention about the Norwegian Synod. It became the largest and most powerful and influential Norwegian Lutheran Synod until its division in the 1880s. As a result of a bitter conflict, typical also division there, about the doctrine of predestination or election, the Anti-Masurian Brotherhood was founded in 1887, as you can see in this picture. Soon more about that. Hope we have time. And then we see the third group of theologians. They were dissatisfied with the extremes of both the Eielsen Synod and even more so the Norwegian Synod, and they sought a middle ground between the two. In 1860, Scandinavian theologians established a new synod that included both Swedish and Norwegian pastors in their congregation, though it was predominantly Swedish. They agreed on the Augsburg Confession as the primary Lutheran confession, as the name says. However, the Swedish and Norwegian factions within the synod largely operated independently and with a growing tendency towards separation. So the Norwegian pastors and congregations wanted to establish a synod of their own. After a friendly agreement, as it says, they departed and formed the Norwegian Augustana Synod. However, differing interests within the group led to the creation of two separate church bodies. In 1870, the Norwegian Augustana Synod on the one side and the Conference of the Norwegian-Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, commonly known as the Conference, on the other side. Their primary disagreement centered on the structure and organization of the church. The Norwegian Augustana Synod was smaller than the Conference and with sympathies for the Haugeans Synod, though it was more open to American influences and the use of English language. Pastors in this synod had held quite high authority. That was interesting comparing with this Hauge ideal than the other Lutheran synods. But their key interest, one of their key interests, was at least the union of churches, which we'll see soon. Regarding the conference, the name Clausen emerges once again. We heard about him. He had left the Norwegian Synod in 1868 due to the controversy about slavery, and later drafted the proposal for the constitution of this conference. The church body was called a conference rather than a synod to emphasize the independence and autonomy of congregations and allowing them to remain free without formal membership. The theological center of the conference was Augsburg Seminary, which was established in 1872 in Minneapolis, is now known as Augsburg University. The conference was strongly opposed to the Norwegian Synod and took an anti-Missourian stance, can we say. But in 1890, the United Church was formed, as you can see also in this picture, through the merger of the conference, the Norwegian Augustana Synod, of these two groups, and the Anti-Missourian Brotherhood, which had its theological college at St. Olaf College in Northfield. This marked a significant step toward a merger of Norwegian Lutheran synods. And now I can give you the full confusion. This is a map drawn by Todd Nickel, and you see here the different synods. I have not mentioned all of them, only the main groups. You can see, you find these pictures. I don't know if it's, yeah, you can. Norwegian Synod, you see Augustana Synod, which became Norwegian and the conference, right? These two groups who got together in the United Church, together with the Anti-Missourian Brotherhood, which was separated from the Norwegian Synod. And here you have the Eielsen Synod, which is going on in the Haugeans Synod, which later also unites. But the Eielsen Synod becomes independent, and there's another Lutheran free that we don't mention now, but you see the structure. And now I want to show you as an example from the Norwegian Synod how a synod was constituted in the new situation in America. And these were old and new elements. The old elements are easy to understand, and it's quite like the Eielsen Synod in many elements. The old elements are copies of the constitution from the Church of Norway. We have the doctrine of the church, the conditions for a pastor, and the use of the liturgical books. This is classical Norwegian Lutheran, can be seen as a continuity, both for pastors and lay people, which also was very important. The Norwegian Synod represented continuity of the Lutheran church and faith as people knew it from the mother country. We can imagine how important that was for people who came to America and wanted this safety and this, stand in their own belief from their mother country. But there were also new elements. I might mention this from the old side, that the pastors has to be rightly examined, regularly called, and officially ordained. That was important for them, that it was involved a study of theology in some way, and that also said they needed theological institutions to educate them. That you come back. Let's look at the new elements, of course, which meant change. Okay, no king, no state church, of course, and democracy more than an idea. And the Norwegian Synod, despite their Lutheran Orthodox tradition, did not vote for an episcopal, but for a synodical congregational constitution, which focused on the congregations. Here it says in the text synodical presbyterial, which comes from an expression from Dietrichson, but it would be correct to call it synodical congregational, and later they also deleted this sentence from the revised constitution. But from the very start, the Norwegian Synod had no bishops, but a president as a leader of the Synod. That is very interesting as a traditional Lutheran church from Norway. And the local congregations, as we can see, had much power. The representatives from the congregation were in the majority compared to the number of the pastors, because, as I said, there were more congregations than pastors. One pastor had to serve several congregations, but every congregation could send lay representatives to the Synod. They had power, the congregations, and they used it. I will show you very soon. And as I also suggested, even though the pastors supported this constitution, of course, and the power of the local congregations and the lay people, they often felt like the pastors in the Church of Norway, and they were often called the state pastors when people talked about them, so the Norwegian state pastors. So it was quite an idea that they were behaving maybe sometimes like them. But the congregations had power, they used it, and also important, each congregation had to establish and maintain a parochial school. That means every congregation had a school and had education as a very important part of their church life. So it was social and church life together, very important. And this had nearly all the synods, all the different synods. So we find an interesting and often discussed history is the connection between the Norwegian Synod and the German Missouri Synod. For me as a German living in Norway, as I said, this was very interesting to look at, including that I could read all the texts in the different languages and understand what they meant, because when the Norwegian pastors, leaders, theologians wrote to the Germans, you can imagine which language that was, not Norwegian. So they had to write and communicate in German with them, because the Germans did not know Norwegian, but it was quite natural in the education of theologians in Norway at that time that they were able to speak German. That was then. Yes. Okay. The thing is that the Missouri Synod very early was clear that they lacked ordained pastors to meet the spiritual needs. And there was little or no help from Norway. They tried to travel to Norway, find several pastors. A few came, but not so many. Therefore, the Synod decided very early to establish its own college for the education of pastors. But meanwhile, they tried to find other possibilities to educate their candidates to pastors, already existing institutions. So 2 delegates of the Synod visited 3 German Lutheran seminaries to find out where they could send their students. And after visiting the different seminaries, they were enthusiastic about the German Missouri Synod and concluded in 1857, in the Missouri Synod and its seminary, we can truly say that we found the same faith in which we were raised, as well as the same idea of how a Lutheran free church ought to be ordered. Let us say quite simply that with regard to baptism, regeneration, the church, and the ministry, the Missouri Synod teaches exactly the same as Pontoppidan and our older dogmaticians. And this was said in 1857, before they had established closer connections together. So this was their impression. The famous leader of the Missouri Synod was, may I say it in German first, Karl Ferdinand Wilhelm Walter, or in American, Walther, who was the main theologian and Lutheran authority for the leaders of the Missouri Synod, of course, but also of the Norwegian Synod until his death in 1887. And we have many letters from Norwegian Synod leaders to Walther and vice versa, all written in German, and especially when they had conflicts. What shall we do? And Walther was first very, what shall I say, and you know best, but then he came with advice, what they often followed. And for the Norwegian Synod pastors, the Lutheran identity was more important than the Norwegian identity. That is an important point. Therefore, it was no problem for them to connect to the Missouri Synod, using its seminary in St. Louis, Mississippi, for their own students. But not all agreed that the Germans had accurate the same faith, with the same teaching and as Pontoppidan. Pontoppidan, the Germans didn't know about Pontoppidan. Of course, they had Luther, and Pontoppidan was an explanation of Luther's catechism. But okay, there was an impression of the Norwegians that it was the same faith. And this disagreement was also visible at some of the doctrinal controversies, as about lay preaching, slavery, and election or predestination. I just short mentioned the slavery controversy, where some congregations chose to leave the synod. And one of the pastors, as I said, was Claus Clausen, who was against a sort of acceptance of slavery in the synod. They were following Walther and the Missouri Synod, formulating that in itself slavery is no sin. But then they also said they will do everything to abolish this. But this sentence was not mentioned later, and it was always the main sentence. The Norwegian Synod is for slavery, right? And Koren, who was one leader of the Norwegian Synod, always said, I don't know any pastor who is for slavery in the Norwegian Synod, but this was the understanding among the lay people and the press, not at least. And one letter shows, written in 1866, a father to a pastor from the Augustana Synod writes in a letter to Norway about the Norwegian Synod: they teach that slavery is not a sin by itself, and that dance and games, card games, are innocent amusements. This is Lutheran, right? But they prohibit lay people's activity in their congregations when the pastor is absent. So that was also a conflict, how much possibilities have lay people, and they always had said only when the pastor is absent. So that is not quite correct. When the pastor was absent, it was possible in some reasons that lay people could preach, and also when the pastor preached wrong. But it was this not often the case, and so it was quite opposite often to the Hauge ideal. Okay, just short about the election controversy, and then I can come to some conclusions about the diversity and the union. I just want to show this is an interesting example of what happened in some cases when they could not agree about things. The first thing is that Walther was accused of being crypto-Calvinist, that he had the same understanding of predestination as Calvin, and this was, of course, for him the worst thing that could happen to him. And he said, and the question was very difficult to understand for us today. When God elects people to eternal salvation, is it because of faith which he had foreseen, or is people's faith part of the election? That means how much has my own will in this process of faith? When I when I come to faith in Jesus, is it only because God from in his eternal election has made that I can believe and that I say yes to him? Or is my faith, my yes or no to God, part of my, be careful with this word, my free will, right? So that was, but both parts were agreed on. Not every person who believes is elected by God. And only when God calls you, you can say yes or no, not only in every time of your life. Okay, I don't have more time for this. I have worked extensively on this by myself. But this interesting thing comes now, that it was first a discussion as a theological controversy between the leaders of the Norwegian Synod, and they only wanted to discuss it among the pastors, wanted to avoid the inclusion of congregations because they understood that was not an easy question for lay people to understand and to vote for or against. And at the beginning of the at the beginning of the controversy, the main theological leader of the Norwegian Synod, Ulrik Wilhelm Koren, expressed in a letter to Volda, "It really looks dark in our synod, as dark as never. The slavery question was a child's play compared with this, and it's very doubtful whether the synod can survive this storm." And this was written 1881 at the very start of this conflict, which lasted until 1887-8. And a storm would come. The controversy about elections spread from the pastors to the laity. Ordinary church members began to discuss this question, and Koren writes in an article, "The question was discussed on streets and in lanes, in stores and in saloons. And families and old friendships broke apart. And on the other hand, former enemies became friends when they only found themselves on this same side of the battle. Congregations withdraw from the synod, and in several letters we find the reason that they stand on their biblical childhood faith and pontificate down against the new teaching, as they called it, of election from the Missourians." So that was the lay people understanding. And here we see the independence and self-confidence of the Norwegian congregations, even against their own pastors. And this is a very interesting example, because two meritorious pastors of the Synod, Herman Amberg Preuss and Jakob Ol Ottesen, we saw the picture of him, they were two founders of the Norwegian Synod and prominent leaders, very prominent leaders. They were dismissed by their congregations, also the son of Ottesen, because they denied to sign under the anti-Missourian teaching of election. And this is the reason why we find in Koshkonong, the Western Koshkonong Church, that was founded when Ottesen was dismissed, and he was standing there with some members of the congregation, and then he suggested to build an own church for them, for the pro-Missourian group, as we may say. Okay? What happened else? The result of the controversy was that in 1887, the Anti-Missourian Brotherhood was founded, and it chose St. Olaf College as their theological institution. 1/3 of the pastors and the congregations withdrew from the Norwegian Synod, and here we say Bernd B.J. Moos, all know him, all of you know him maybe. He was among the founders of St. Olaf's School in the 1870s, and also St. Olaf College in 1887 as theological institution, and he was a leader among the anti-Missourians. This is the reason why I show him. I could have shown other persons that were even more prominent in this discussion, but this is because we are here today. But it was not the end of the Norwegian Synod. As I said, 2/3 still were in the Norwegian Synod, but the Synod loosened the ties to the German Lutherans, and we can see a movement towards a union between Norwegian Lutherans from several synods. Okay, then I have to land, but this, okay, you know what comes now, the conclusion. First, about the diversity that we can short, because this we have seen. We saw diversity from the very beginning with different groups and their synods, and also schisms and divisions in all Norwegian Lutheran synods in America. How can we explain this? We have already mentioned some important things. we had no boundaries from the state church. Every group could form its own church. Every group had its ideal of the right church according to God's word and the Lutheran confessions. We too meet strong personalities that we don't have to forget, and there were personal motives combined with theological ones in all these struggles. There were many theological controversies. Both pastors and lay people became very engaged, especially in the Norwegian Synod. But there were not only theological reasons, as we can imagine. There are also cultural and social patterns from Norway for the choice of sides in the conflicts. We can see this in the election controversy, where people from one area in Norway were suddenly against the other area where they came from, and they chose sides, even though they may not have idea what it was really. We again see the power of the congregations. They paid, and for them, and they had power. At last, now, toward the church union, what happened? Despite the many synods and divisions or schisms, there were also efforts of union, of Lutheranism in America, also across boundaries. We find several mergers already in the 1860s, 1890s, on the doctrinal Lutheran ground, not national borders. But there were different efforts to unite Lutherans. They did not last. Then we see a growing desire of union among Norwegians. When we look at the Norwegian, when we look at the Norwegian Lutherans, we find early results in the merger of the conference, the Norwegian Augustana Synod, and the Anti-Missourian Brotherhood, as I mentioned, in the Church, United Church 1890. This was the middle position between the Haugeans Synod and the Missouri Synod. Now the United Church was a larger synod in numbers than the Haugeans and Norwegian Synod together. Before, the Norwegian Synod was the largest. But there was a growing desire of union also now in these synods, and theological meetings were held in the following years and decades. It took time, but it happened. There was Norwegian-American fellowship and friendship also across synodical borders, of course. The Norwegian Americans had a common cultural heritage. They spoke the same language, they lived in the same region, the Upper Midwest, and had contact across synodical borders. They met in literary groups, welfare groups, singing societies, sports associations, lodges, and other societies with Norwegian heritage, and they met in everyday life. They were bound together by a common Lutheran Norwegian hymnody. That's also important, the same psalms, that doesn't mean a lot. And catechetical instruction based on Pontoppidan, also in the Norwegian Synod. The Norwegian independence from Sweden in 1905 strengthened the Norwegian national feelings even more. And there was also the second generation growing up, and this is also an important factor. We often know after the first generation, people think new, more or different. And this was important both for the theologians and the lay people. The role of the laity was important, but even though the union was formed by the theologians in their constitutions. And in 1912, the theologians from the different synods agreed on a paper, the settlement in Norwegian Oppgjør, which was a theological compromise, discussing the questions of election, that both views could be acceptable and so on. And now the way for a union was prepared, and in 1917, the Haugeans Synod, the United Church, and the Norwegian Synod merged to the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America, and now over 90% of all Norwegian Lutherans in America were united in one church, and some smaller groups in the different synods did not agree and lived in other synods and churches. And here I have a short view of the situation then from 1917, and also how it worked on. Very short also from Todd Nickel map. Okay, that was not the whole history, but that was my presentation. Thank you very much. Okay, my plan was 45 minutes, and I tried it at home, but it didn't work here. Okay. And then, yeah, if one is interested in sources, Mark Rundquist among them, yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I don't know if you have time for questions, but they can. Oh, yeah, okay, they can come down and ask. Okay. But thank you for your attention.